my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Amina Wadud. And Dr. Amina Wadud is Professor Emeritus of Islamic Studies and currently visiting scholar at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. She is a quintessential scholar activist, pressing the boundaries of gendered exclusions and hierarchies in religion, the academy, and society, provoking deeper, more creative possibilities for thought and practice. She is the author of Quran and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective, and Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam. This work that she has done, not only in these books, but in many, many articles, has been path-breaking. It's work that includes an exhaustive reinterpretation of the Quran that is gender inclusive. For Dr. Wadud, this work, this kind of scholarship, is not only an intellectual enterprise, though it is indeed an amazing intellectual contribution to religious thought. She does this work as a way of demonstrating how Quranic hermeneutics that is inclusive of female experiences and of the female voice could yield greater gender justice in Islamic thought and contribute toward the achievement of that justice in Islamic practice. As Hiba Abu-Gidiri writes, quote, Wadud in sum is offering her work as an exegetical contribution, one that is uniquely female inclusive to the larger historical corpus of Quranic exegesis. In contributing this new hermeneutical model, Wadud is essentially expanding and moving beyond an intellectual legacy that dates back 1,400 years, unquote. In addition to her scholarly work, her scholarly work is known for the ways in which it beautifully interweaves scholarly ideas with personal reflections on what it means to live out her Muslim faith. As she writes, quote, in the Quran and Woman, she writes, quote, mercifully, the more research I did into the Quran, unfettered by centuries of historical androcentric reading and Arabo-Islamic cultural predilections, the more affirmed I was that in Islam, a female person was intended to be primordially, cosmologically, eschatologically, spiritually, and morally a full human being, equal to all who accepted Allah as Lord, Muhammad as prophet, and Islam as din, unquote. Dr. Wadud is one of the 500 most influential Muslims, but this hardly captures the insistent and generative way in which she combines scholarship and activism. As is widely known, one of her most boundary-pushing gender jihad moments was her leadership of a mixed-gender congregation in Friday Prayer in New York in 2005, an event that sparked national and international attention. Dr. Wadud has tirelessly worked for and with grassroots Muslim women all over the globe, having spent significant amount of time in Malaysia and South Africa, working with women's groups on practical issues such as HIV/AIDS. She's consulted in over 40 countries with organizations and giving public lectures. She has been a scholar and an activist in the ways in which she has engaged the Academy itself, giving and its discourse on gender in Islam. She's forcefully criticized the American Academy of Religion for failing to provide enough space for the discussion of Islam and gender issues, and candidly described in her writings the ways in which she's been treated as a token Muslim scholar. I take this opportunity to offer my gratitude to you for your path-breaking work in religion and society and the Academy that has really blazed trails for all of us here. It is my honor to present this courageous and brilliant scholar activist, Dr. Amina Wadud.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I begin, as always, in the name of Allah, the Divine, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. I want to thank you for coming out on Saturday morning, and thank Jennifer for the invitation, and Tracy for, of course, saying things that no human being could possibly walk behind and still be a human being. But I'm going to try to do that anyway. What I'm going to share with you is something that actually I could stand here and just talk off the top of my head, because it really is based on my life work and my sole interests. But I decided sometime between prayer this morning and breakfast that I would instead reduce a presentation that I had made on the same topic in Sydney, Australia earlier this year. There's reasons for me doing that, and the basic reason is it will allow me to also share with you some quotes of people that I have worked with regarding this issue. And my goal, you'll see ahead of the game, my goal is to talk about three major trends. In fact, I would say that these were sort of the bracketing characteristics of Muslim women's reform today. And they're going to be secular Islamic feminism, or secular Muslim feminists, Islamists, sort of neoconservative political Islam-motivated gender agenda, and Islamic feminism. And obviously I'm using these other two in order to be able to cast a kind of bracket around Islamic feminism and to define these areas. There are obviously nuances and other subgroups and divisions that we could talk about. But I think if you understand these three in their historical and ideological evolution, it will be much easier to then engage all of the other kinds of depictions that are there. I've got water, yes. So, in the spirit of postmodernism, I began with my location. I worked on gender issues that would lead to Islamic feminism before it had a name. However, I never lost sight of my aim to make certain articulations within the faith or from a faith perspective. Let me just make sure that I can not look at the mic at any point, just bring myself as close to it as possible. Born in the West to Christian parents, my sojourn in Islam had nothing to do with Western feminist movements because they tended to marginalize women of color and poor women. I was motivated by my spiritual yearnings then and now. From my religion at birth, Christianity, I take certain ideas which remain true to the gender jihad in Islam. First is the idea that God is love. So crucial, in fact, I chose the name Wadud, an attribute of God, one of her 99 names in Arabic that means all-loving. Second, I was born into the civil rights movement in the United States. My preacher father took me to the March on Washington with Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King when I was 11 years old. There has never been a separation between ideas of God and the fight against oppression, no matter what form oppression might manifest itself in. By the time I entered college, I also accepted the global diversity in perceptions of and experiences with the sacred, what the Abrahamic traditions refer to as God. I was also more attuned to the diversity of work done by people who profess some kind of belief in the ultimate and who assume responsibility in their work or actions relative to their perceptions of a divine mandate as part of the divine command. Not long after I entered college, I became a practicing Buddhist. From Buddhism, I carried away two ideas that are still paramount to my gender jihad. Meditation reminds us to breathe in the presence of the sacred reality all the time. To focus our energies honestly and individually towards that which is immanent in all the creation is part of our connection to all things in the creation, to each other, as well as to the creator of the universe. Secondly, because Buddhism is a non-theist tradition celebrating the sacred, it was more of an imperative for me to consider the ways in which ideas about the sacred, or words articulated and developed into theologies, can just as easily become webs that trap us, leaving us lost in the discussion about the ultimate. It behooves us then to be cognizant of what we mean and what another person might mean when we assume that we are talking about the same thing just because we use the same word, God. Indeed, God is bigger than any discourse, acts in ways not fathomable to human beings at all, and yet is intimately connected to each human being, closer than your own jugular vein, the Quran says, even if any one human being chooses to remain unresponsive to that living presence or reality. This benevolence, then, is not meant to offend or impose upon people who do not believe in God. It is nevertheless important for me to say because it bears heavily upon my location. This essay is focused on the theological framework of the debates about women's empowerment in the context of Islam today. We cannot say anything about Islam and Muslims until we are clear what we mean by Islam. To properly discuss the status of Muslim women, we need to interrogate the meaning of the word Islam. People involved with the struggle for or against Islamic reform often operate on a presumption that what is meant when the word Islam is used is both well known and agreed upon. When someone says, for example, Islam prohibits homosexuality, or in Islam a woman must wear hijab, the sources of these abstractions is frequently without clear, consistent evidence and consensus. In other words, people derive what they mean by Islam from a large range of sources, and as such come up with conflicting ideas about the phenomena known as Islam. Is Islam what the sources say, what Muslims do, or just my personal relationship with the divine? One important contribution to the women's movement to internal and international debates about what is Islam around the turn of the century was to render a distinction between Muslim cultures and Islamic primary sources, the Quran, the established Sunnah or practices of the Prophet, authentic hadith or his statements, and even Islamic law. Despite this distinction, what any Muslim might do, and some higher order or system of Islamic thought, as more common parlance, it's confounding to note how often normative Islam is still taken to be, according to the most conservative definitions, to measure the increments of progress against these neoconservative norms or expectations. I don't know how many years, for example, it was that I used to say that my own exegesis is an alternative, as if to reify patriarchal interpretation. It is important both to assert new ideas, analysis, and critiques in order to contest the authority and purview of conservatism by the act of asserting new definitions. But at some point, we must stick to them and integrate them into the range of normativity. How will Islam ever progress when Muslim progressors are stuck in these static notions about normative Islam? The problem with the epistemological limitations is precisely how to move forward within Islam. Such conservative and static understandings and norms do not allow for changes to occur unless these changes are seen as radical alternatives, if not altogether impossible. This is crucial in the area of gender reform. In the Quran, the words Islam and Muslim are used with regard to an historical community, that evolved from the time of the Prophet Muhammad, upon him be peace, as well as with regard to a state or posture vis-a-vis creation and the Creator, the posture of conscientious surrender. When the Quran refers to all of nature as Muslim, then all of creation is harmonious, following a certain order and balance between its constituent parts. This is true for so much around us on a day-to-day basis, but we most likely take that for granted. As the sun sets in the evening and rises in the morning, most human beings only notice when there are catastrophes related to the regular aspects of nature and our environment, like snow before trick-or-treat. The more expansive the possibilities of what we understand as critical to a definition of Islam, the more potential there is for growth and progress, such that changes will still reflect that whole. It is critical to establish then a working and authoritative definition of the word of Islam in order to accurately discuss Muslim women's reform today. I will build upon the definition of Islam encapsulated by its most basic and fundamental principle called Tawheed. There is no Islam without Tawheed. At one level, this refers to the nature of God as one and affirms the monotheistic theology. Tawheed can also be applied to social justice, referring to its intensive verbal root form, which indicates a kind of dynamism. The making of one from fragments or pieces, or the unification of the many into a unity. The principle of Tawheed mandates a specific kind of relationship between human beings, which must then be adjudicated within the context of our current global realities. I'll come back to this a little bit later. As stipulated in the Quran, Islam's primary sacred text, the role of women in Islam is to be Khalifa on the earth, a moral agent of Allah within the sacred order of balance and harmony in the universe. This teleology is confirmed by the Quranic passage, Inni ja'ilun bil ardi khalifa. Indeed, I will create on the earth an agent. Woman was not created as a byproduct, helpmate, or second-class citizen of man. Furthermore, her agency is in a direct relationship to God, unmitigated by men's agency, or by family. This agency is to be manifest by actions fil ard, that is, on the creation, standing up for justice and gender equality, working to reform asymmetrical gender policies, and toppling tyrannical practices, policies, epistemologies, and governments are all part of the agency in the divine human relationship. This is mandated by Allah and established by the prophetic sunnah. Coincidentally, this is the same as the role for men in Islam. Women are human. They do not depend upon men for their humanity. It is given to them by Allah. While women have always been a part of the community, expected to confirm the development of Islam within that community, in the earliest period, they did not enjoy equal participation in establishing the fundamental paradigmatic basis of what Islam means. As the Muslim empire spread geographically and politically, women and men were unaware of the significance that participation or contributions to that fundamental canon of Islam would have effect in, how that would have effect in the future. Now, I'm not trying to say that there's some kind of misogynist plot, but at some point within the Islamic tradition, precedent became a certain aspect of authority and legitimacy. That is, whatever happened before makes it legitimate and gives it some kind of authority. And since women were outside of that main contribution, the idea of precedence then runs into the problem that when we look back over the record of the Islamic historical past, especially the intellectual development, we don't have the same record with regard to women's voices. And all of a sudden, the fact that the voices weren't there before, people will then say, well, you can't have the voices today, and in fact, they'll call the voice aura, which is a word that means literally the genitalia, but means prohibited in the public space. And so when women began to come forward in order to try to articulate their perspective on the issues, they were locked into the grid of the authority of precedent because it didn't happen before, which is the same thing they say about women leading to prayer. Well, it didn't happen before, therefore it can't happen now. So the principle of precedent as authority came into being, and I thought this was always very interesting because it's sort of like, you know, Muslims were living their lives and they were engaged in relationships of family and community, and belief in God and developing the practices of the law. And it's sort of like men say, well, you know, family is really important and we really like you to be available for us for sex and to take care of the kids. So don't worry about the, you know, the paradigmatic stuff. We'll take care of that for everybody. And then, you know, 100, 600, 1,000 years later, they said, oh, but you weren't there, so you can't say anything now. And this is something that I think has been very interesting in the way in which precedent as authority has worked in our community. Today, we participate fully in establishing new canon, constructing new traditions as a corrective of the asymmetry between women and men in Muslim communities historically. However, we do not go about this without some contention between our voices, our perspectives, our methods, and our objectives. This is natural and inevitable for the most part. So let's look a little bit at the history of the modern Muslim women's movements. The prevalence of patriarchal culture always had at least some minority advocates against it. And whenever I start talking about the movements today, people want to refer back to one or two of these examples from our past, Salama, one of the Prophet's wives, or Aisha. And the idea that you would have one or two names literally that are available as if to counter the whole patriarchal thrust is a little bit problematic in my mind, but it is not to ignore that there were these voices. However, the evidence then of certain exceptional voices against gender inequality is not really my concern. Rather, the concern is to look at mass movements of women against gender status quo, especially to challenge injustices. It makes little difference if the injustice was established by intent or by the accident of discrimination. Muslim women's movements are coincidentally connected seamlessly to certain global developments. Chief among these developments was the rise and fall of colonialism. It should go without saying that the goal of colonialism was never to liberate the women or the men in the conquered regions. Nevertheless, when the revolutions against colonialism began to take shape, women participated as well as men to end the empire. Eventually, we were all ushered into the uniform establishment of the nation state, for good or for ill. Unfortunately, women were not equal beneficiaries of the spoils of the new nationalist regimes. This is the place where the modern Muslim women's movement began in earnest. Women's organizations were primarily wings of larger nationalist organizations. But Marco Badran points out, women had a rude awakening when it became clear that liberal men were not prepared to implement their promises to integrate women into public life after nominal political independence, end quote. At this point, it was necessary for women to organize amongst themselves towards gender-specific goals for political, social, economic, and legal rights. In the 19th century, global awareness, recognizing your own local, national, or regional realities of day-to-day life, combined with awareness of realities unlike your own day-to-day reality in other regions or circumstances in the world. Global awareness is the root force towards pluralism. Our human reality today cannot exist without this sense of pluralism. The capacity to accept others quite different from oneself as equal to oneself. Our present time is not the only time, our place not the only place, our customs not the only customs, our worldview not the only worldview. These basic elements of pluralism become essential for the global Muslim women's movement. The first voices of Muslim women collectively to protest the status quo were from the well-educated, often well-traveled, and well-to-do. They had seen that the world is not uniform. They had experienced cultural possibilities and the world of ideas that challenged the entrenched ideas being promoted as sacred and unchangeable, or as necessary for cultural identity and authenticity. Because of their own advancement in education, they were aware of the possibility of women's participation outside the cloistered realm of the home. They began to stand up for change in their own cultures and communities. They stood up as Muslim women and as citizens of their own nation states. Basic issues like health, reproduction, education were coupled with more complex issues of politics and economics. A nation state needs citizens of intellectual competence who utilize national resources to help towards the development of that nation state. Reproduction has been mostly regarded as inevitable. So with the rest of the world, emphasis was shifted away from older forms of production to national productivity. If the labor of women and children could be called towards national productivity, then so be it. If women were not given the opportunity to develop through universal education, for example, they would never be able to fulfill their role as citizens. They would not be able to assist with the development and independence of the nation state and its objective to stand alongside other nation states. So in the first wave of Muslim women, of the Muslim women's movement, there was a thrust against the entrenched ideas about gender apartheid and women's restriction in the public space. After this first wave movement, the clarity of the secular feminist articulations of Muslim women was surmised vis-a-vis the goals and methods of the women's movement itself. The secular feminist movement requires the removal of religion from the debates over rights. It is premised upon the idea that religions are too patriarchal for redemption, or that religion, in this case Islam, is the cause of women's oppression. Whether religion is then relegated to a personal, more emotional response or altogether irrelevant depends upon the religiosity of the person speaking. Deference is given unequivocally to the international instruments in setting up the agenda for gender reform. The adoption of the term universal in these instruments might go unchallenged or at least be deemed more acceptable than any usage of Islam. Quote, although universalism as it exists today is generally criticized for its implicit ethnocentrism and leaning toward so-called Western values, most women nevertheless recognize the need for support the principle of, and work towards a new definition of universality and human rights, end quote. It is the use of Islam as a universal which is the most problematic. Quote, they do not see religious debate as the main strategy for social change. At the time of the establishment of the nation state in the context of Muslim majority countries, the crucial question of the role of religion in the political process led to two opposing sides. On the one side, those who advocate for a separation of the state from religions were soon to be recognized as secular and Western. The term secular would morph then, quote, the secularist outlook is crucial. The secularist outlook is basically one that starts by marginalizing God, or sometimes even announcing his death, placing the human at the center of the universe and as its logo. This is, by the way, a quotation from an Islamist. Through gradual stages of the Muslim secularist was born in the 19th and the 20th century. Some of the Muslim women who opted away from religion also identified as feminists to the exclusion of their identities as Muslim. They didn't say secular at the time, but this came into this is how it morphed into something else. This would be most coherently expressed in response to the rise of an outspoken public voice in favor of Islam, the Islamist movement. Surely the nation-state model did not solve all problems, and surely it created new ones. Throwing off the shackles of colonialism put every aspect of the colonialist worldview into question. The most uniform response to the problems related to the post-colonial Muslim context was the cry for a return to the glorious past of the Islamic empire, with the Islam is the solution. A new development also emerged in the Muslim women's movement. Islam is indeed a global phenomenon. Islamic history does indeed have an impressive ideological and political legacy. Since this preceded the rise and invasion of the colonists, then it must indeed be superior, offering the solution to all the problems faced by Muslims. That is, if we could go back to the glory of this Islam. The simple reality of any movement backwards as a solution for the present, let alone the future, should have been warning enough against taking this path uncritically. It should have given some indication of the problems that would arise for this perspective to handle the post-colonial dilemma, the rise of a nation state and the movement towards radical global pluralism. It did not. The merit of the call to return to Islam was both authentic and authoritative. Consequently, all other worldviews were not only seen as alien, but also seen as counterproductive to the Muslim social order, if not outright un-Islamic. The Iranian Revolution, with the force of the people to remove not only the Shah, but also the negative alliances with Western hegemony, was replaced by national, cultural, and religious authenticity. This was the high point of the Islamist movement. It created even more fervor in the agendas of Islamists in other parts of the